The first time I noticed something was wrong with my marriage, I was holding a crystal wine glass that cost more than my first car. The delicate stem felt fragile between my fingers as I watched my husband Ryan announce our future without bothering to consult me. "Mother needs us," he declared to the pristine dining room, his voice carrying that familiar note of finality. "Madeline and I will be moving in with her next month." I nearly dropped the glass. The red wine inside trembled, much like my hand, as I stared at him across his Mother Margaret's antique mahogany table. The same table where just 6 months ago he'd introduced me to his family as his fiancée. "That's wonderful news," Margaret cooed, reaching over to pat Ryan's hand. Her collection of gold bangles clinked together like wind chimes. "The house is far too big for just me now, and with my health being what it is." His sister Chloe shot me a look I couldn't quite read. "How generous of you both," she said, cutting into her beef tenderloin with surgical precision. "Especially Madeline, giving up her independence so soon after the wedding." Independence. The word hit me like a slap. I'd already given up my job at Ryan's insistence, convinced by his promises of a fresh start and a life where I'd want for nothing. Now he was giving away what little autonomy I had left, without even asking. "We haven't discussed this," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Ryan's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "What's there to discuss, darling? Mother needs us. Family comes first." Family. His family. I watched as they exchanged knowing glances across the table and suddenly felt like an outsider looking in through frosted glass. The crystal stem grew slick in my palm. "Of course," I managed, forcing a smile that felt like cracking porcelain. "Family first." Liam, Ryan's best friend who joined us for dinner, cleared his throat. "Speaking of family, Ryan, didn't you mention that business trip to Singapore next month?" "All arranged," Ryan replied smoothly. "Chloe's transfer to the London office is perfectly timed. She'll help get everything settled before she leaves." Another piece clicked into place. The transfer Chloe had been celebrating all evening wasn't just coincidence. This had been orchestrated, planned without my knowledge or consent. I was being maneuvered like a chess piece, and everyone at the table knew the game except me. "More wine, dear," Margaret's voice dripped with honey-coated concern. "You look a bit pale." I shook my head, still gripping the crystal stem. The wine inside had stopped trembling, but something else had started. A slow burn in my chest, a clarity I hadn't felt since before the wedding. "Actually," I said, setting down the glass with deliberate care, "I'm not feeling well. Would you excuse me?" I didn't wait for an answer. The bathroom was my sanctuary, its marble countertops cool against my palms as I leaned over the sink. In the mirror, my reflection stared back. A woman I barely recognized, dressed in clothes Ryan had chosen, wearing jewelry his mother had suggested. My phone buzzed in my clutch. A text from Ryan. "Don't make a scene. We'll discuss this at home." But there was nothing to discuss. The decision had been made, the trap had been set, and I'd walked right into it. As I stared at my reflection, I remembered something my father used to say before he died. "The thing about a cage, honey, is that you don't realize you're in one until you try to spread your wings." I straightened my spine and wiped away a smudge of mascara. They thought they had me figured out. The compliant wife, the grateful daughter-in-law, the perfect addition to their carefully constructed world. They had no idea what I was capable of. I returned to the dining room where dessert was being served. Ryan's hand found mine under the table, squeezing it in what he probably thought was reassurance. I squeezed back, smiled, and began to plan. Moving day felt like a funeral procession. I watched the movers carry our life into Margaret's Victorian mansion, each box another nail in the coffin of my independence. Ryan had already left for work, his kiss on my cheek as perfunctory as a handshake. "The East Wing will be yours," Margaret announced, her silk robe rustling as she guided me through corridors lined with oil paintings of stern-faced carters. "Though of course you'll want to spend most of your time downstairs. The kitchen needs a woman's touch." I caught my reflection in a gilded mirror. Designer dress, pearls at my throat, everything perfect on the surface. 6 months ago, I'd been closing million-dollar deals. Now I was being shown where to store the good china. Mother prefers her tea precisely at 4, Chloe added, materializing beside us. She was dressed for the office in a sharp blazer and heels that clicked against the hardwood floors. And don't forget her evening medications, the schedule's on the fridge. I'm sure Madeline will manage beautifully, Margaret said, patting my arm. After all, what else does she have to occupy her time? The words stung like paper cuts, small, sharp, and deliberately inflicted. I smiled anyway, the expression feeling more like a grimace. I was thinking of looking for part-time work, actually. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Oh, darling. Margaret's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. Ryan wouldn't hear of it. Besides, who would take care of things here? Before I could respond, Chloe's phone buzzed. That's my car. London calls. She air-kissed us both, the gesture not quite reaching her eyes. Don't worry, Madeline. You'll find your place. I watched her stride away, her designer handbag swinging like a pendulum, counting down the moments until my imprisonment would be complete. The first week passed in a blur of domestic demands. Margaret's needs were endless. Specific meals at specific times, daily walks in the garden, social calls that required perfectly arranged tea trays. Ryan came home late, if at all, citing market volatility and client meetings. One evening, as I was sorting Margaret's medications, Liam stopped by unexpectedly. I found him in the study with Ryan, their conversation cutting off abruptly when I entered. Madeline! Liam's smile seemed strained. How are you settling in? Wonderfully, I lied, setting down Margaret's evening tea. Everything's perfect. Perfect, Ryan echoed, not looking up from his phone. Mother mentioned you've been a bit distracted lately. The roast was overdone last night. The casual cruelty of it made my fingers twitch. I wanted to throw the teacup against the wall, watch the fine bone china shatter like my illusions about this marriage. Instead, I said, I'll do better tomorrow. That's my girl. Ryan finally looked up, his smile not reaching his eyes. Oh, and I'll be in Singapore next week. Mother's physical therapy appointments are in your calendar. Liam shifted uncomfortably. Ryan, maybe we should discuss. Nothing to discuss, Ryan cut him off. Madeline understands family obligations, don't you, darling? I nodded, the perfect wife, while something dark and dangerous unfurled in my chest. Later that night, I found a crumpled business card in Ryan's jacket pocket while doing laundry. A hotel in the city, with a woman's name and number scrawled on the back. Standing in the laundry room, surrounded by the trappings of domestic servitude, I made a decision. I smoothed out the card and took a photo with my phone, then replaced it exactly as I'd found it. The washing machine hummed, a steady rhythm like a war drum. Upstairs, Margaret's voice carried through the halls. Madeline, where's my evening tea? I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and gathered the serving tray. But as I climbed the stairs, I wasn't thinking about tea or medications or perfectly pressed linens. I was thinking about the small inheritance my father had left me, still untouched in an account Ryan knew nothing about. I was thinking about the hotel business card and all the other little threads I could start pulling until this perfect family tapestry unraveled completely. Coming, Mother, I called out, my voice honey-sweet. I wouldn't want you to wait. The hotel's elegant facade mocked me as I sat in my car across the street. Ryan's Singapore trip had been a lie, like everything else. I'd followed him here after he'd left another client dinner, watching him stride through those gleaming doors with the confidence of a regular guest. My phone buzzed. Margaret's name flashed on the screen, the 4th time in an hour. I silenced it, my hands steady despite the rage burning in my chest. The front desk clerk had been surprisingly helpful when I'd stopped by earlier, dropping Ryan's name and flashing the platinum credit card he'd insisted I carry for emergencies. Of course, Mrs. Carter, your husband's usual suite is 1504. Usual suite. The words had settled in my stomach like broken glass. Now I sat watching, gathering evidence with my phone's camera. A woman emerged from the hotel, tall, blonde, expensive. She air-kissed Ryan goodbye with practiced familiarity. I zoomed in, capturing every detail of their intimate farewell. My phone buzzed again. Liam this time. I answered, if only to maintain appearances. Madeline, thank God. Margaret's having one of her episodes. She's threatening to call the police if you don't come home. Episodes, I repeated, watching Ryan check his reflection in the hotel's glass doors. Like the one last week when I missed book club, or the one before that when I tried to visit my sister. Silence crackled over the line. Then, softly, you know, don't you? About the blonde? Or about how Chloe's transfer was planned months ago? Tell me, Liam, what exactly should I know? It's complicated. No, I said, starting my car as Ryan's figure disappeared into the night. It's actually very simple, but you can tell Margaret I'll be home soon. Wouldn't want to upset the family dynamic. I drove home through streets blurred by unshed tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of fury, of liberation, of possibilities crystallizing like ice in my veins. Margaret was waiting in the foyer, her silk robe cinched tight, face arranged in an expression of wounded concern. Where have you been? I needed my evening medications an hour ago. Did you? I moved past her toward the kitchen, my heels clicking against the marble floors. Strange since I set them out before I left, right next to your afternoon tea. The tea you dumped in the plant when you thought I wasn't looking. She faltered, just for a moment. I don't know what you're talking about. I've been feeling quite unwell. Save it. I turned to face her, letting her see the change in me. I know about Ryan's business trips. I know about Chloe's perfectly timed transfer. I know this whole setup was planned before I ever said I do. Colour drained from her face. You ungrateful. What I don't know, I continued, my voice deadly quiet, is why? Why the elaborate scheme? Why me? Because you were perfect, she spat, mask finally slipping. Desperate enough to give up your career, naive enough to play nursemaid, and just smart enough to manage the household while Ryan focused on what really matters. I laughed, the sound sharp enough to make her flinch. And now? Now you'll do exactly what you're told, she said, recovering her composure. Unless you want Ryan to know about your little investigation tonight. I pulled out my phone, pulled up the photos I'd taken. You mean these? Don't worry, I've already sent copies to my private email. Insurance, you might say. Speaking of insurance. I paused, savouring the moment. How's your health, really? Because I've been documenting your episodes too. Amazing how they only happen when I try to leave the house. The blood drained from her face. You wouldn't dare. Try me. I stepped closer, dropping my voice. I learned from the best, after all. You taught me everything about manipulation, you and Ryan both. Consider this my final exam. I headed for the stairs, but turned back one last time. Oh, and Margaret, don't wait up for Ryan. He's having a late night at the office. Suite 1504, to be exact. As I climbed the stairs, her shocked silence followed me like applause. In our bedroom, I opened my laptop and began composing 2 emails. One to my old friend at the SEC about some interesting irregularities in Ryan's client accounts, and another to a divorce attorney recommended by my sister. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning to get interesting. Ryan came home just before dawn, reeking of expensive perfume and scotch. I was waiting in his study, his laptop open before me, spreadsheets glowing in the dark like accusations. You're up late, he said, loosening his tie. The casual confidence in his voice made my skin crawl. Early, actually. I've been learning so much about finance. I turned the screen toward him. Like how to hide money through shell companies in Singapore. Fascinating stuff. His face hardened as he recognized the files. You've been in my private accounts. Private? Like your private suite at the Grand? Or your private meetings with Jessica Winters from compliance? I kept my voice steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. Tell me, does she know about the irregularities in the Peterson account, or is she just another pawn? He moved faster than I expected, slamming the laptop shut. You have no idea what you're talking about, don't I? Your mother was right about one thing. I am smart enough to manage things. Smart enough to make copies of everything I found. The slap caught me off guard, more from surprise than force. We stared at each other in the sudden silence, both shocked by the line he'd just crossed. "Madeline," he started, his voice softening to that familiar, manipulative tone. "You're upset, I understand. But you're playing with things you don't comprehend." I touched my cheek, feeling it burn. "Like our marriage?" "I've given you everything," he said, pacing now. "A beautiful home, financial security, status." "You've given me a prison," I cut in, "with your mother as warden and you as the absent guard." His laugh was ugly. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do? Leave? With what money? What skills? You're nothing without this family." The words hit harder than his slap, because 6 months ago I might have believed them, but now they just fueled the fire. "That's where you're wrong," I said, standing. "I'm everything without this family, and I can prove it." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." A knock at the study door made us both freeze. Margaret stood there in her silk robe, face arranged in concern. I heard voices. "Is everything all right?" "Fine, Mother," Ryan said quickly. "Madeline and I were just discussing—" "How I'm leaving," I finished for him. "Tonight." The mask of concern slipped from Margaret's face. "Don't be ridiculous. Where would you go?" I walked to the door, pausing beside her. "You know what's funny? You both thought you chose me because I was weak. But you actually chose me because I'm exactly like you, willing to do whatever it takes to win." "If you leave this house," Ryan called after me, "you leave with nothing." I turned back one last time. "Check your email. I sent copies of those financial records to the SEC 10 minutes ago. You might want to lawyer up." His face went white. "You're bluffing." "Am I? I learned from the best, remember? You taught me all about leverage." I glanced at Margaret. "And you taught me all about patience. Consider this my graduation." I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my legs shaking but my mind clear. Behind me, I could hear Ryan's panicked phone calls beginning, Margaret's shrill demands for explanations. I'd packed a small bag days ago, hidden in the back of my closet along with my father's inheritance paperwork and copies of everything I'd found. As I changed clothes, I caught my reflection in the mirror, the red mark on my cheek already fading, but something in my eyes burning brighter than ever. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who'd walked into this house 6 months ago. That woman had wanted to be loved. This one wanted justice. I picked up my bag and walked out of the Carter mansion just as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of revenge. The hotel room felt like neutral territory, though Liam's nervous pacing suggested otherwise. 3 days after my escape from the Carter mansion, he'd reached out, claiming he wanted to help. "The SEC investigation is moving fast," he said, running fingers through disheveled hair. "Ryan's being questioned tomorrow." I sipped my coffee, watching him over the rim. And he's desperate. He's talking about pinning everything on you, claiming you were the one manipulating accounts, using his passwords without authorization." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. "Can he do that?" "He already is. Margaret's lined up character witnesses, society friends who'll swear you are unstable, resentful of the family's wealth." He stopped pacing, faced me directly. "They're building a narrative that you orchestrated this as revenge for his affair." "Well," I set down my cup, "they're half right. This isn't a joke, Madeline. They're trying to destroy you." "No," I stood, retrieving my laptop from my bag. "They're trying to survive. There's a difference." I opened the files I'd been compiling. Not just Ryan's financial records, but emails between him and Margaret dating back months before our wedding. Their careful planning, their assessment of potential wives, their strategy to secure someone who could manage Margaret's care while Ryan expanded the family business. "Jesus," Liam whispered, scanning the emails. "They vetted you like a job candidate." "More like a hostage." I clicked through to more recent correspondence, but they made a mistake. They assumed I'd be grateful for the cage they built. My phone buzzed, Chloe's name flashing on the screen. I answered on speaker. "You've really done it now," Her voice crackled with barely contained fury. Mother's in the hospital. Another episode? I kept my tone neutral. A real one this time. The stress you've caused. The stress of her lies being exposed, you mean? I interrupted. Or the stress of Ryan's fraud investigation? Silence stretched between us, then softer. What do you want? The truth. About everything. I met Liam's worried gaze. Including what happened to Ryan's first fiancée. The sharp intake of breath on the other end confirmed what I'd suspected since finding old newspaper clippings in Margaret's study. That was an accident, Chloe whispered. Was it? Because those old articles suggest otherwise, and I bet the police would be very interested in reopening that investigation. You wouldn't. Try me. I ended the call, hands shaking slightly as I turned to Liam. How long have you known? He sank into a chair. I suspected, but Ryan never talked about Sarah. It was like she never existed, until she threatened to expose his financial dealings. I pulled up another file, a scanned letter I'd found hidden in Margaret's desk. Then she had an unfortunate accident on the family yacht. What are you going to do? I closed the laptop, suddenly tired. What they taught me to do, leverage everything. My phone buzzed again, a text from Ryan. We need to talk, come home. Home. The word felt like ash in my mouth. They're scared now, Liam observed. That makes them dangerous. I know. I gathered my things, decision crystallizing. That's why I'm meeting with the district attorney tomorrow. Sarah deserves justice too. Madeline, Liam caught my arm as I headed for the door. Be careful. The Carters. They're not just manipulative. They're murderers? I finished for him. Yes, I know, but they forgot something important when they chose me. What's that? I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. I'm not Sarah. I don't just have evidence. I have backup plans for my backup plans. I left him there, stepping into the evening air with purpose. My phone buzzed again, another text from Ryan. Please, I can explain everything. I typed back 3 words, so can I. Then I headed to my next meeting, with Sarah's sister, who'd been waiting 5 years for someone to ask the right questions about her sister's death. The Carters had taught me well about patience and planning. Now they'd learned just how good a student I'd been. Sarah's sister Rachel looked exactly like her photos. Same haunted eyes, same determined set to her jaw. We met in a quiet corner of the district attorney's office, where the walls seemed to pulse with secrets. They'll deny everything, Rachel said, spreading out old photographs across the conference table. They always do. Not this time. I placed my own files beside hers. Financial records, emails, the letter that proved Sarah had known about Ryan's fraud before her death. This time we have proof. The district attorney, Helena Martinez, studied the documents with sharp eyes. This connects Ryan to financial crimes, but proving murder after 5 years... A knock at the door interrupted us. Liam burst in, face pale. They know, someone leaked. The lights went out. In the chaos that followed, I felt rather than saw someone grab my arm. The emergency lights flickered on just in time to see Rachel crumple to the floor. A security guard, not one I recognized, standing over her with a taser. Mrs. Carter, he said, his grip tightening. Your husband sent me to bring you home. I fought, but he was twice my size. Through the commotion, I glimpsed Helena unconscious at her desk, Liam nowhere in sight. The fake guard dragged me toward the emergency exit, my files scattered across the floor like broken promises. You really should have listened to Mother. Ryan's voice came from the shadows. He stepped into view, adjusting his perfect tie. Family matters should stay in the family. Like Sarah? I spat, still struggling. Was she family when you killed her? His smile turned cruel. Sarah was an unfortunate accident. You, on the other hand... He nodded to the guard. Take her to the car. Mother's waiting. They forced me into a black SUV, Ryan sliding in beside me. As we pulled away, I saw Rachel being loaded into an ambulance, Liam arguing with actual security guards. Your evidence is gone, Ryan said conversationally. The DA's office had an unfortunate break-in. Nothing was stolen, but some files were damaged in the chaos. My heart sank. You can't hide everything. No. He pulled out his phone, showed me a news article already going live. Troubled wife's false accusations. Mental health concerns rise. Margaret's friends are very influential in local media, and your recent erratic behaviour has everyone quite concerned. The pieces clicked together. They weren't just destroying evidence, they were destroying my credibility. Any accusation I made now would sound like paranoid delusions. What about the SEC investigation? Resolved. His smile widened. Your unauthorized access to company accounts has been documented. Very troubling behavior, especially combined with your obvious instability. The SUV stopped outside Margaret's mansion. She waited in the doorway, wheelchair-bound, the picture of maternal concern. Welcome home, dear. The doctor's here to help you rest. I saw the man behind her, medical bag in hand, and real fear gripped me. They weren't just going to discredit me, they were going to sedate me, maybe commit me. You won't get away with this, I said, but my voice shook. Ryan leaned close, his whisper almost gentle. We already have. 5 years ago, and now. You should have learned from Sarah's mistake. No one challenges the Carter family and wins. The doctor approached with a syringe. I tried to run, but the guard's grip was iron. It's for your own good, Margaret called from the doorway. You're not well, dear, but we'll take care of you. Family always takes care of its own. The needle slid into my arm, and the world began to blur. As consciousness faded, I saw Chloe's car pulling into the driveway, her face a mask of concern for the witnesses surely watching. The perfect family, rallying around their troubled daughter-in-law. My last thought before darkness took me was of Sarah's letter, the one they hadn't found, still hidden in a safety deposit box under my maiden name. The one piece of truth they couldn't erase. If I survived this, they'd learn what real revenge looked like. But first, I had to wake up. The sedatives kept me compliant for 3 days, but they didn't know about my tolerance. Built up slowly over weeks once I'd discovered Margaret's private pharmacy. When clarity finally returned, I found myself in my old bedroom, now fitted with subtle but effective restraints on the windows and doors. A nurse watched me constantly, except during Margaret's daily visits. Appearances had to be maintained after all. It was during one of these visits that everything changed. Such a shame, Margaret sighed, wheeling herself closer to my bed. The doctors say you've had a complete breakdown. Paranoid delusions about Ryan, about poor Sarah. I kept my expression vacant, letting the pills they thought I'd taken do the talking. Sarah, I mumbled, had proof. Margaret's hand stilled on her wheelchair. What did you say? In the safety deposit box, I slurred, watching her face. The letter. Everything. She reached for the phone beside my bed, but I was already moving. 3 days of playing docile had lulled them into carelessness. I grabbed her wrist using her own momentum to trap her arm against the chair. You're hurting me, she gasped. Like you hurt Sarah. I pressed harder. Or is that just another delusion? The door burst open, Ryan and Chloe right on schedule. I'd counted on their daily visit, timed perfectly with Margaret's tea-time routine. Let her go, Ryan demanded, taking a step forward. Don't move, I warned, my other hand revealing the syringe I'd palmed from the nurse's station. Or Mother gets a taste of her own medicine. Chloe's face went white. You're proving everything we've said about you. No, I cut her off. I'm proving everything Sarah said about you. All of you. I turned to Margaret. Tell them about the letter. The real one, not the suicide note you forged. She's delusional, Margaret started, but I pressed the needle closer. The safety deposit box opens in 20 minutes, I said quietly. Automatic timer. Everything goes to the FBI if I don't stop it personally. Sarah's original letter, proof of Ryan's fraud, and evidence of what really happened that night on the yacht. Ryan's composure cracked. You're bluffing. Like you bluffed about the SEC investigation being resolved? I smiled. Check your phone. The news should be breaking now. He grabbed his phone, face draining of colour as he read. The carefully constructed house of cards was falling. How? Chloe whispered. Liam. I met her shocked gaze. He's been working with the FBI for months. Those client meetings with Ryan, all recorded. The break-in at the DA's office, staged to make you think you'd won. Margaret's shoulders sagged, the matriarch's mask finally crumbling. What do you want? The truth. Now. Or everything comes out. Sarah's murder, the fraud, all of it. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Then Margaret spoke, her voice hollow. It was supposed to be simple. Sarah knew too much, but she agreed to stay quiet for a price. Ryan met her on the yacht to pay her off. But she wanted more, I finished. So you had Chloe drug her drink, made it look like an accident. You can't prove any of this, Ryan snarled, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Already have. The FBI has been watching this house since I was brought back. Everything that's happened in the last 3 days, all documented. I released Margaret's arm, standing straight. It's over. As if on cue, the sound of sirens filled the air. Ryan lunged for the door, but it burst open, revealing federal agents with Liam and Rachel behind them. Ryan Carter, the lead agent announced. You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Sarah Matthews. As they led the family away in handcuffs, Rachel approached me, tears in her eyes. Sarah would be proud. I watched through the window as the Carter empire crumbled, each family member isolated in separate vehicles. Their perfect facade shattered like the teacup that slipped from my trembling hands. No, I said quietly. Sarah would be at peace. There's a difference. The sirens faded into the distance, carrying with them 5 years of secrets and lies. I stood in the empty mansion, surrounded by the wreckage of false perfection, and finally allowed myself to breathe. The prison visiting room smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation. Margaret sat across from me, her designer clothes replaced by institutional grey. Her wheelchair now standard issue rather than custom-made Italian leather. I received your letter, I said, placing the unopened envelope between us, but I wanted to hear it from you directly. She stared at the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. You didn't read it? Some truths need to be spoken, not written. The silence stretched between us like a tightrope. Through the window behind her, I could see Ryan being led to another visiting room, shoulders hunched under the weight of his 20-year sentence. Sarah wasn't Ryan's first victim, Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was his second. The first was my daughter, my real daughter. The words hit like physical blows. What? Chloe was adopted, though she doesn't know it. My Elizabeth? She discovered Ryan's earliest frauds when she was 16, threatened to expose him. Margaret's mask cracked, revealing something ancient and painful beneath. The car accident that killed her wasn't an accident at all. Your own son. I helped cover it up, she cut in. Convinced myself it was to protect the family, but really I was protecting myself, my reputation, my perfect life. A bitter laugh escaped her. I've been paying for it ever since. By letting him kill again. By trying to save you. She met my eyes directly. Why do you think I pushed him to marry you? Someone strong enough to end it all? Understanding dawned, cold and clear as morning frost. You chose me to destroy him. To destroy us all. We deserved it. She pushed the envelope back toward me. The proof is in there. Elizabeth's real death certificate, adoption records, everything. Do with it what you will. I stood, leaving the envelope untouched. Keep your secrets, Margaret. I'm done with the Carter family's truth. What will you do now? The question followed me to the door. I paused, thinking of the women's shelter I'd started funding with my divorce settlement, of Sarah's sister Rachel working beside me to help other victims find their voice. I'm going to live, I said simply. Something your family never learned how to do. Outside, Liam waited by his car. You okay? No, I admitted, but I will be. We drove in silence until he pulled up outside my new apartment building. Before I got out, he handed me a familiar crystal wine glass. the one from that first dinner where everything began to unravel. "Found this when they were clearing out the mansion," he said. "Thought you might want it." I held it up to the sunlight, watching rainbows dance through the crystal. Then I walked to the nearby park, Liam following curiously. At the edge of the duck pond, I drew back my arm and threw the glass as hard as I could. It hit the water with a satisfying splash, disappearing beneath the surface. "Littering is illegal, you know," Liam observed. "So is murder," I replied. "But some things need to break before they can be forgotten." That evening, alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop to find an email from Chloe. The subject line read, "I know about Elizabeth. I deleted it without reading it. Some truths weren't mine to carry." I poured myself a drink in a cheap glass tumbler, savouring the difference between its honest weight and the crystal's false elegance. On my wall hung a single photograph, not of the Carter family, but of my father on his last good day, teaching me how to play poker. "Always know when to fold," he'd said, "but never forget how to bluff." I raised my glass to his memory, to Sarah's justice, to Elizabeth's ghost, and to my own reflection in the window, no longer a perfect Carter wife, but something far more valuable. Myself. The cheap glass made a dull clink against the windowsill, nothing like Crystal's musical ring, the sound of truth over perfection, of freedom over facade, of a story finally, completely, my own.
I'm Carla, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the afterthought in my family. It wasn't always obvious, but looking back, the signs were there from the start. My younger sister Sarah burst into the world like a supernova, all golden curls and dimpled smiles. From day one, she had our parents wrapped around her little finger. Me? I was the quiet one, more interested in my chemistry set than in making friends. I still remember my 10th birthday. I'd been hoping for a new microscope, dropping hints for weeks. Instead, I got a frilly dress that made me look like a cupcake. "But Mom, I hate dresses," I protested. "Nonsense, you'll look just like Sarah," she beamed, completely missing the point. As we grew older, the divide only widened. Sarah breezed through school on charm and good looks, while I buried myself in books and science experiments. "Did you hear? Sarah's been nominated for prom queen." Mom gushed over dinner one night. "That's great," I mumbled, trying to muster some enthusiasm. I won first place in the science fair today." "Oh, that's nice, dear," Dad said absently, already turning back to Sarah. "So, Princess, have you picked out your dress yet?" And so it went, year after year. My achievements, no matter how significant, were always overshadowed by Sarah's latest triumph, no matter how trivial. The state science fair in my senior year was my moment to shine. I'd spent months perfecting my project on sustainable biofuels. When they announced the winners, I could hardly believe my ears. "First place goes to Carla Johnson." I was ecstatic. Finally, something even my parents couldn't ignore. Or so I thought. "That's great, honey," Mom said distractedly when I told her the news. "But we can't make it to the awards ceremony. Sarah has a dance recital that day, and you know how important that is to her." I watched them fuss over Sarah's costume and makeup, my trophy gathering dust on a shelf. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one I was getting used to. When the acceptance letters started rolling in, I could barely contain my excitement. Full scholarship to a prestigious university? It was more than I dared to hope for. "Mom, Dad, I got in." I burst into the living room, waving the letter. "Full ride and everything." Mom glanced up from her magazine. "That's nice, dear." "Sarah, didn't you say you needed help picking out a prom dress?" Just like that, my big moment was brushed aside. Again. "But, it's a full scholarship," I tried again, my voice smaller this time. Dad patted my shoulder absently. "Good job, kiddo. Sarah, Princess, let's go shopping. Can't have you showing up to prom in just anything, can we?" I watched them pile into the car, my acceptance letter crumpled in my fist. It was a familiar feeling, but it still stung. Despite the lack of fanfare from my family, I packed my bags and headed off to college with high hopes. For the first time, I was free from Sarah's shadow, free to be just Carla. College was a revelation. Suddenly, my passion for science wasn't weird or nerdy, it was respected, even admired. I threw myself into my studies with renewed vigor, determined to make the most of this opportunity. Meanwhile, Sarah followed the path our parents had always dreamed of. She enrolled in the local community college, more interested in parties than classes. "College is so hard," she whined during one of our rare phone calls. "I don't know how you do it, Carla." I bit back the urge to point out that maybe if she spent less time partying and more time studying, she might find it easier. Instead, I just mumbled some vague encouragement and changed the subject. It was during my sophomore year that Sarah dropped her bombshell. "I'm engaged," she squealed over the phone. "Mike proposed last night. Isn't it romantic?" Mike. Her high school sweetheart. The guy who'd once asked me if science was like, really hard and stuff. "That's great, Sarah," I managed, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. "Have you set a date?" "We're thinking right after graduation," she gushed. "Oh, Carla, it's going to be perfect. You'll be my maid of honor, won't you?" The wedding was exactly as you'd expect. Sarah was radiant, Mike looked uncomfortable in his tux, and I stood there in my frilly pink nightmare, pasting on a smile for the photos. "Isn't this perfect?" Mom whispered to me during the reception. "This is what every mother dreams of for her daughter." I wanted to ask if she'd ever dreamed anything for me, but I held my tongue. It was Sarah's day, after all. As I threw myself into my studies and later my career, Sarah's life seemed to follow a script straight out of our parents' dreams. Within a year of her wedding, she announced her first pregnancy. "I'm going to be a grandmother." Mom squealed over the phone. "Oh, Carla, isn't it wonderful?" I murmured my congratulations, trying to ignore the implicit question in her voice. "When are you going to settle down, Carla? When will you give us grandchildren?" Emma arrived 9 months later, a bundle of pink blankets and loud cries. I flew home for the weekend, dutifully cooing over my new niece and enduring the not-so-subtle hints from my parents. "You know, Carla," Dad said, bouncing Emma on his knee, "you're not getting any younger. Don't you want this for yourself?" I gritted my teeth. "I'm focused on my career right now, Dad." Mom clucked her tongue. "Career is all well and good, dear, but family is what really matters." I bit back a retort about how they'd never seemed to care much about my career before. Instead, I plastered on a smile and changed the subject. 2 years later, Liam joined the family. Once again, I played the role of the doting aunt, all while fielding questions about my own lack of family. Meanwhile, I was making strides in my career as a biotechnologist. Long hours and hard work paid off, and by 30, I was a senior researcher. My parents' response to this news? A distracted, "That's nice, dear," as they cooed over new pictures of Emma and Liam. It was around this time that I decided to buy a house. I'd saved carefully, living frugally while my colleagues splurged on expensive cars and vacations. When I finally found the perfect place, a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a great neighborhood, I was over the moon. "Mom, Dad, I bought a house," I announced during our next phone call. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "A house?" Mom repeated. "All by yourself?" "Yes, all by myself," I said, my excitement deflating a little. "It's a great investment, and—" "But it's such a big house for one person," Mom interrupted. "What will you do with all that space?" I sighed. "I'll enjoy it, Mom. It's mine." "Well," she said, her tone making it clear she didn't approve, "I suppose if that's what you want." "Oh, did I tell you? Emma lost her first tooth yesterday." And just like that, we were back to talking about Sarah and her kids. The months following my house purchase were a whirlwind of work and settling into my new home. I threw myself into decorating, turning each room into a reflection of my personality. It was during this time that I started to feel a shift in my family dynamics. The usual calls from my parents became less frequent, and when they did call, there was an odd tension in their voices. One evening, I received a call from my mother. "Carla, dear," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "We're having a family dinner next week. You'll be there, won't you? We need to talk." I agreed, my suspicions raised. In my family, "we need to talk" usually meant trouble was brewing. The night of the dinner arrived, and I pulled up to my parents' house with a sense of foreboding. Sarah's car was already in the driveway, and I could hear the excited shrieks of Emma and Liam from inside. Dinner was a tense affair. My parents kept exchanging glances, and Sarah seemed unusually quiet. Mike, Sarah's husband, kept clearing his throat as if he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Finally, as we were finishing dessert, my father cleared his throat. "Carla, we need to talk about something important." Here it comes, I thought. "What's up, Dad?" He glanced at my mother, who nodded encouragingly. "Well, you see, sweetie, we've been thinking. That big house of yours, it's really too much for just one person." I felt my hackles rise. "Dad, we've been over this. I like my house. It's mine." "Yes, but..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. My mother jumped in. "What your father is trying to say is that Sarah and her family need more space. The kids are growing, and their apartment is getting cramped." I looked at Sarah, who was suddenly very interested in her plate. "Okay, and?" "And we think," my mother continued, her voice sickly sweet, "that since you're single and have no children, you should give your house to Sarah and her family. Just give them the keys and move out." For a moment, I was speechless. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to yell, "Gotcha," and reveal it was all a joke. But all I saw were expectant faces. "You can't be serious," I finally managed. "Now, Carla," my mother said, her tone patronizing, "don't be selfish. Sarah needs her own space more than you do." "Selfish?" I repeated, my voice rising. "How is it selfish to want to keep the house I worked hard for and paid for myself?" "It's your sisterly duty to help in times of need," my father chimed in. I turned to Sarah, who was still avoiding my gaze. "And what do you have to say about this?" She shrugged, finally meeting my eyes. "Well, it would be nice to have more space for the kids." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own family, asking me to give up my home, acting like I was the unreasonable one for refusing. "No," I said firmly, standing up. "Absolutely not. I'm not giving up my house." As I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, I heard my father call out, "Think about it, Carla. Family should come first." The days following that disastrous family dinner were a blur of disbelief and anger. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, unable to believe my family's audacity. How could they even think to ask such a thing? My phone buzzed constantly with messages and calls from my parents and Sarah, but I ignored them all. On the third day, as I was trying to focus on work, my phone lit up with a call from a number I didn't recognize. Figuring it wasn't family, I answered. "Hello, is this Carla?" A woman's voice came through, sounding disapproving. "Yes, who's this?" "This is your Aunt Mildred." "I can't believe what I'm hearing about you, young lady. Your poor sister needs a home for her children, and you're living all alone in that big house. Shame on you." I felt my blood pressure rising. "Aunt Mildred, that's not..." "In my day," she continued, not letting me get a word in, "family helped family. We didn't hoard our resources like misers." "I'm not hoarding anything," I snapped. "It's my house. I bought it with my own money." "Well," she huffed, "if you're not going to use all that space, you should at least consider donating your eggs. It's not like you're using them anyway." I was so shocked I nearly dropped the phone. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said primly. "You're not getting any younger, you know. Tick-tock." I hung up without another word, my hands shaking with anger. How dare she? How dare any of them? But it didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I was bombarded with calls and messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Each one had an opinion on what I should do with my house and my life. My great-aunt Edna left a voicemail. Carla dear, it's your great-aunt Edna. I just wanted to say, it's not too late to find a nice man and settle down. Then you'd need that big house. It was relentless. Every ping of my phone brought a new judgment, a new guilt trip. I felt like I was going crazy. I started to dread checking my phone, wincing every time it buzzed. I threw myself into work, staying late at the lab just to avoid going home to more messages. It was during one of these late nights at work that I got sick. Nothing serious, just a bad cold, but enough that my boss insisted I take a few days off to recover. So there I was, curled up on my couch with a box of tissues, feeling miserable both physically and emotionally. My phone had been mercifully quiet for a few hours, and I was just starting to relax when I heard it. A noise at my front door. Like someone was fumbling with the lock. My heart started racing. Was someone trying to break in? I got up as quietly as I could, creeping towards the door. Through the window, I could see figures on my porch. Familiar figures. I yanked the door open, startling the people on the other side. What the hell are you doing? There, caught red-handed, were my parents and Sarah. They looked like deer caught in headlights, frozen in the act of trying to break into my home. My mother was the first to recover. Carla, dear, we were just worried about you. You haven't been answering your phone. So you decided to break into my house? I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. My father at least had the decency to look embarrassed. We didn't think you'd be home. We thought you'd be at work. And that makes it okay? I was practically shouting now. What were you planning to do? Move Sarah in while I was gone? Sarah, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Carla, you're being hysterical. We were just going to wait for you to come home. I noticed for the first time that there was a car parked behind them, loaded with boxes and furniture. My blood ran cold as I realized the full extent of their plan. You were going to move in, I said, my voice flat. You were actually going to move into my house without my permission. Now, Carla, my mother started, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I knew so well. We've discussed this. Sarah needs the space more than you do. We thought if we just took the initiative. You thought wrong, I cut her off. This is my house, mine. I bought it with my own money, money I earned through hard work. You have no right to it. Just then, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. My neighbors, the Johnsons, were peering out their window, clearly concerned by the commotion. Mr. Johnson caught my eye and held up his phone, mouthing, "Police?" I nodded, grateful for their concern. Turning back to my family, I said, "I've called the police. You need to leave. Now." "You wouldn't," my father scoffed. "Your own family?" As if on cue, the sound of sirens filled the air. My family's faces paled. The police car pulled up, and 2 officers got out. "Is there a problem here?" one of them asked, eyeing the scene warily. I took a deep breath. "Yes, officer. These people were attempting to break into my home." "Carla," my mother gasped. "How could you?" The officers looked at my family. "Is this true?" My father started to stammer out an explanation, but the officer held up a hand. "Sir, attempting to enter a property without the owner's permission is a serious offense. I'm going to have to ask you all to leave immediately." As the officers escorted my family off my property, I stood in the doorway, shaking. I couldn't believe it had come to this. "You'll regret this, Carla," Sarah called over her shoulder as they were leaving. "You'll end up old and alone." I slammed the door shut, sliding down to sit on the floor, my back against it. Tears started to flow freely now, a mix of anger, hurt, and relief. My phone had fallen silent. No more calls from distant relatives, no more guilt-tripping messages. It was as if I'd been excommunicated from the family. Part of me was relieved, but another part ached for the connection, dysfunctional as it had been. It was in this tumultuous state that I received an unexpected message. It was from my Aunt Maggie, my mother's sister. We hadn't spoken in years, not since she'd had a falling out with my mom over some old family drama. "I'll meet you tomorrow at Café Bleu at 1400 hours." Intrigued and desperate for any ally, I agreed to meet her. The next day, I found myself sitting across from Aunt Maggie in a cozy corner of Café Bleu. She looked older than I remembered, but her eyes were sharp and kind. "Carla," she began, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I'm so sorry for what you've been through. Your mother called me, trying to get me on her side. But there's more to this story than you know. That's why I asked you to meet me." My curiosity piqued, I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Aunt Maggie took a deep breath. "Your parents and Sarah, they're in serious financial trouble. Sarah and Mike have been living beyond their means for years. Luxury cars, designer clothes, lavish vacations, all on credit." I shook my head in disbelief. "But why? How?" "It's worse than that," Aunt Maggie continued. "Mike has a gambling problem. A bad one. He's been secretly draining their accounts for years." The pieces started to fall into place. The desperate attempt to get my house, the constant pressure. "But what about Mom and Dad?" I asked. Aunt Maggie's face grew grim. "They lost a significant amount of money in a pyramid scheme a few years back. They've been barely keeping their heads above water. They were planning to move in with Sarah and Mike as soon as they got your house." I sat back, stunned. "How do you know all this?" "I work at the bank where they all have accounts," Aunt Maggie explained. "I noticed some suspicious activity and started digging. When I confronted your mother about it, she cut me out of the family." My mind was reeling. All this time, while I'd been working hard and saving, my family had been digging themselves into a hole. And they'd tried to drag me down with them. "Carla," Aunt Maggie said gently, "I know this is a lot to take in. But I think it's time we did something about this situation. If you're willing, I have an idea." Armed with the information Aunt Maggie had shared, we decided to dig deeper. We hired a private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Diana who came highly recommended. For weeks, we waited anxiously as Diana worked her magic. Finally, she called us in for a meeting. What she revealed left us speechless. Mike, Sarah's husband, had been leading a double life. He was involved in an affair with none other than my cousin Jenny, Uncle Bob's daughter. "He's been funneling money to her for months," Diana explained, showing U.S. bank statements and hotel receipts. "Expensive gifts, weekend getaways, you name it." "But where did he get the money?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. Diana's face grew grim. "From his gambling wins, and from your parents." Aunt Maggie and I exchanged shocked glances. The betrayal ran deeper than we'd imagined. We decided to host a family gathering at my house. The irony wasn't lost on me, the very house they had tried to take from me would be the stage for their undoing. The day of the gathering arrived. I watched as my family members trickled in, their faces a mix of curiosity and smugness. They probably thought I was going to cave to their demands. Once everyone was seated, I stood up, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. "I've called you all here today because there are some things you need to know," I began. I laid out everything, the financial troubles, the gambling, the affair. With each revelation, I watched the color drain from their faces. Sarah jumped up, tears streaming down her face. "It's not true," she screamed, before collapsing into sobs. "Mike, tell them it's not true." But Mike was already halfway to the door. Uncle Bob, his face contorted with rage, caught him by the collar. "You son of," he growled. "That's my daughter you've been fooling around with." My parents sat in stunned silence, the reality of their exposed financial ruin seemingly more devastating than the fact that they had tried to steal my house. The relatives who had judged me so harshly began to stammer out apologies. "We had no idea," Aunt Mildred muttered. "Carla, we're so sorry." As the chaos unfolded around me, I felt a strange sense of calm. The truth was out. The lies and manipulations were exposed. In the weeks that followed, our family was turned upside down. Sarah, unable to forgive Mike's infidelity, filed for divorce. With nowhere else to go, she and the kids moved back in with our parents. But their reprieve was short-lived. The bank foreclosed on their house. They were forced to downsize to a small, rented apartment, all 5 of them crammed into a space smaller than my living room. As for me, I watched it all unfold from a distance. After much soul-searching and several tearful nights, I made the difficult decision to sever all ties with my immediate family. "You're doing the right thing, Carla," Aunt Maggie assured me one afternoon over coffee. "It's not easy, but it's necessary for your mental health and well-being." Aunt Maggie had become my rock, the family I chose when my blood relatives had let me down. Our weekly coffee dates became a cornerstone of my new life. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself settling into a new routine. Without the constant drama and demands of my family, I had time to focus on myself. But with that came a startling realization: I was lonely. "You know," Aunt Maggie said one day, "there's a world out there beyond work and home. Why don't you try something new?" With her encouragement, I decided to join a local rock climbing group. It was far outside my comfort zone, but as I strapped on the harness for the first time, I felt a thrill of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. That's where I met Alex. He was belaying another climber, his strong hands confidently handling the rope. When he turned and flashed me a warm smile, I felt my heart skip a beat. "First time?" he asked, noticing my nervous fidgeting with the equipment. "Is it that obvious?" I laughed. We struck up a conversation, and I was immediately drawn to his kind eyes and easygoing nature. As we talked, I learned he was a wildlife photographer, with a passion for capturing the beauty of nature. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement about the possibility of a relationship. Alex was kind, adventurous, and understood the complexities of family dynamics in a way few others could. We began dating, our shared love for nature and understanding of complex family dynamics bringing us closer. Before I knew it, we were discussing marriage, a concept that once seemed foreign and unattainable to me. Through it all, Aunt Maggie remained my steadfast support. She became the mother figure I had always yearned for, but never had. "Carla," she said to me one day, her eyes misty, "I want you to know something. I've changed my will. I'm leaving everything to you." As I hugged her, tears streaming down my face, I marveled at how much my life had changed. The path hadn't been easy, but it had led me to where I was meant to be. With Aunt Maggie's love, Alex's support, and my newfound strength, I was ready to embrace whatever the future held. My world changed drastically when I was just 5. Dad had passed away from a sudden heart attack, and not long after, Mom decided to remarry. His name was George. He had a rough look and even a rougher way of talking, something that seemed to scare me right from the get-go. George brought not just his belongings into our little home, but his daughter, Liza, who was 2 years my senior and, as I'd soon find out, twice as mean. I remember the first time I met Liza. She had this smug smile plastered across her face, looking down at me as if I was some sort of bug she found amusing. "So, you're the baby of the house?" "Well, not anymore. Better get used to it," Liza sneered, her eyes scanning me like I was her new project to fix or break. Mom tried to make things sound all sugar-coated when she talked about them moving in. "Ella, honey, it's going to be wonderful to have a bigger family. Liza will be like the older sister you never had." But Liza was no sister to me. The first few days she moved in, she laid down the law, her law. My toys weren't mine anymore, they were ours, which meant they were hers whenever she wanted. And when I protested? Well, let's just say George didn't like that at all. "Ella, stop being selfish. Learn to share with your sister," he'd grumble, his voice deep and usually laced with annoyance. Mom never stood up to him. Whenever I went to her, hoping she'd take my side just this once, she'd always have the same old tired lines. "Ella, please. Just try a little harder to get along. For me, okay?" She'd plead, her eyes always looking a bit too tired, a bit too sad. Liza knew she had the upper hand, and she milked it every chance she got. If she broke something, somehow it was my fault. If she lost something, somehow I had stolen it. But one particular afternoon sticks out in my memory like a sore thumb. Liza had been particularly cruel that day, hiding my favorite doll and claiming she had no idea where it was. I found it later, tossed in the trash can outside. I remember holding the dirty, slightly torn doll as I walked into the house, tears streaming down my face. "Look what she did, Mom. Look." I cried, holding up the doll for her to see. Mom glanced at the doll, then at my tear-stained face, and for a moment, I thought she'd finally see my side. But then her eyes shifted towards the living room where George was sitting, watching TV. "Ella, maybe it was an accident. Just let it go, please," she whispered, her voice tense as she glanced nervously towards the living room. Liza just laughed from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "Crybaby," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for me to hear. That night, as I lay in bed clutching the now clean but still ripped doll, I realized that this was my new normal. Liza wasn't going anywhere, and neither was George. And Mom, well, she was there but not really there for me. Things took a sharper turn when Mom announced she was pregnant. I remember feeling a mix of emotions. A little brother or sister could mean someone else on my side, right? Wrong. It just meant more reasons for Mom and George to pay attention to anything but me. Tommy was born on a chilly morning in November. He was a quiet baby, hardly ever cried, but he needed constant attention, as all babies do. Mom was either feeding him, changing him, or trying to catch a few minutes of sleep. And George? Well, he was over the moon about having a son. Liza and I were pushed further to the back burner. But while I felt more isolated, Liza seemed to relish it. It was like she thrived on the chaos, knowing she could get away with anything as the focus wasn't on us anymore. One evening, I was trying to finish some homework at the kitchen table, struggling to concentrate over the sound of Tommy's fussing. Liza waltzed in, dropped her bag on the table, and scattered my papers everywhere. "Hey, I was using those," I snapped, my frustration peaking. "So? Move over, I need the table," Liza retorted, not even looking at me as she started to rummage through her bag. Before I could say anything else, George stormed into the kitchen. "What's all this noise about? Can't you see your mother's trying to get Tommy to sleep?" "Liza's trying to take over the table when I'm still using it," I said, standing my ground despite the knot in my stomach. George's face turned a shade I knew too well, and his voice was even and dangerous. "Ella, stop your complaining and go to your room. Let your sister use the table." "But Dad." "He's not your dad. Don't call him that." Liza cut in, her words sharp and biting. That stung more than I expected, and without another word, I grabbed my things and stormed off to my room, slamming the door behind me. I pressed my back against it, sliding down to the floor as I fought back tears. I felt so alone, cornered in a house that no longer felt like home. After that night, I learned to keep my head down. Liza took advantage, of course, always finding new ways to torment me when no one else was looking. George never did anything about it. If anything, he seemed to agree with whatever Liza said, which only made her bolder. "Shouldn't you be nicer to me? I mean, we're practically sisters." I once tried to reason with her, hoping to break through her tough exterior. Liza laughed, cold and harsh. "We're not sisters. We're not even friends. Remember that." And I did. Every single day that I lived in that house, I remembered. My room became my sanctuary, the only place I felt somewhat safe. But even there, the sounds of a happy family, a family that didn't include me, filtered through the walls, a constant reminder of where I stood. As soon as I finished high school, I knew I had to get out. Staying in that house wasn't an option anymore, It was suffocating, like trying to breathe underwater. So, I moved to the city. It was a fresh start, a chance to be who I wanted to be without anyone hovering over me, dictating what I could or couldn't do. The first few weeks were tough. I remember walking into my tiny studio apartment for the first time, feeling a mix of excitement and terror. It was all on me now. No more Liza, no more George, just Ella, trying to make it on her own. I found a job at a local cafe to pay the bills and signed up for a nail technician course. Nails were something I always loved doing, a creative outlet that let me escape the real world for a bit. The course was tougher than I expected. The instructor, Mrs. Jenkins, was a stickler for perfection. "If you're going to do it right," she'd often say, peering over her glasses as she inspected our work. I pushed through, got my license, and started looking for a place to set up shop. The perfect spot turned out to be a small room on the ground floor of an old building. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The landlady, Mrs. Petrov, was a tough old bird who'd seen it all. When I went to sign the lease, she eyed me skeptically. "You sure you can handle this, girlie? It's a tough business." I met her gaze, my resolve firm. "Yes, Mrs. Petrov. I can handle it." She grunted, handing over the keys. "We'll see. Pay your rent on time and we won't have any problems." Starting my own business was brutal. Money was tight, and there were days I barely made enough to cover lunch. But slowly, word got out. My clients liked my work, and they started bringing their friends. Positive reviews trickled in, and with each one, my confidence grew. Just when I thought I had everything figured out, life decided to throw me a curveball. It was a typical busy Tuesday when my phone rang, the screen flashing Mom, which usually meant something was up. I took a deep breath before answering. "Hi, Mom. What's up?" I tried to keep my tone light, but I was already bracing for whatever was coming. "Ella, sweetheart, I hope you're sitting down. I have a favor to ask," Mom began, her voice shaky, which immediately put me on edge. "I'm at work, Mom. What's going on?" I wiped my hands on a towel, stepping into the back room of my salon. "It's about your sister, Liza. She's moving to your city and needs a place to stay, just for a little while, until she finds a job," Mom explained, her words rushing out like she wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. I felt my stomach drop. "Liza? Mom, are you serious?" There was a heavy sigh from her end. I know it's a lot to ask, but she's trying to start over, Ella. She's changed, she really has." The idea of living with Liza again made my skin crawl, but hearing the pleading in Mom's voice, I was torn. "I don't know, Mom. Please, Ella. For me? It won't be for long, I promise." And just like that, I found myself agreeing to let Liza stay. "Fine, but just for a little while, okay?" "Thank you, darling. I'll let her know." The next day, Liza arrived at my doorstep with 2 suitcases and a smile that looked too sweet to be genuine. "Hey, Ella. Long time, no see, huh? Thanks for letting me crash here. I really appreciate it," she chirped, stepping inside before I could even respond. "Yeah, sure. Let's just make sure it's temporary, okay?" I said, eyeing her suitcases with suspicion. Liza laughed, a bit too loudly. "Of course. I'll be out of your hair before you know it." The first week wasn't as bad as I expected. Liza seemed like she was really trying to make an effort. She cleaned up after herself, made small talk, and even offered to split groceries. "So, how's the job hunt going?" I asked one evening as we shared a surprisingly pleasant dinner. Good. I've got a couple of interviews lined up next week," Liza replied, sounding optimistic. "That's great. Just remember, you can't stay here forever," I reminded her, not wanting her to get too comfortable. Liza nodded, her expression serious. "I know, Ella. And thanks again. I know I wasn't the best sister back in the day, but I'm trying to make things right." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But there was always that nagging doubt in the back of my mind, remembering all the times she had deceived me before. As days turned into weeks, I noticed a shift in Liza's behavior. She started coming home late, missing her interviews, and hanging out with a questionable crowd. The old Liza was resurfacing. "Liza, we need to talk," I finally said one night after she stumbled in past midnight. "What's up?" Liza slurred slightly, clearly having had a few drinks. "This isn't working. You said you'd look for a job, but all you're doing is partying. You need to get it together or find somewhere else to live," I said firmly, my patience wearing thin. Liza rolled her eyes, her old defiance flashing. "Chill, Ella. I'll get a job. Just relax." But I couldn't relax. Not with her in my house, disrupting the peace I had worked so hard to build. Liza's promises of job hunting had quickly dissolved into late nights and shady new friends who seemed to pop in and out of my apartment like it was a downtown bar. My patience was wearing thin, and I was close to kicking her out when I met Alex at a friend's party. Alex was different from anyone I'd ever met. He was genuine and seemed genuinely interested in what I did for a living, unlike most guys who glossed over it once they heard nail technician. "So, you really run your own business? That's pretty impressive," Alex said as we sat tucked away in a quieter corner of the noisy living room. "Yeah, it's been a wild ride, but I love it. It's mine, you know?" I replied, feeling a spark of pride flicker within. We started seeing each other, and things were going great, except for one thing, Liza. She had taken an unsettling interest in Alex. At first, it was just lingering looks, but then she started making excuses to stick around whenever he came over. It wasn't long before I caught her trying to be a little too friendly. One evening, I came home earlier than usual to find Liza draped a bit too close to Alex on the sofa, laughing at something he said. The scene made my blood boil. "Having fun?" I asked, my voice sharp as I dropped my keys on the counter a little louder than necessary. Liza jumped up, a guilty flush on her face. "Oh, hey, Ella. We were just chatting, you know, getting to know each other better." Alex looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Liza and me. "Yeah, just talking. Ella, can we chat for a sec?" I nodded, pulling him aside into the kitchen. Once out of earshot, I didn't waste time. "What was that all about?" Alex rubbed the back of his neck, looking genuinely confused. "I'm not sure. She's been really forward lately." I didn't want to say anything. I didn't know how to handle it without making things weird for you. Determined to put an end to it, I confronted Liza later that night. "We need to talk, now," I said, standing at the entrance of her room. She looked up, feigning innocence. "What's up?" "You know what? This thing with Alex? It ends now. He's not interested, Liza. Back off," I stated bluntly, my tone brooking no argument. Liza's face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, come on, Ella. What's the harm in a little fun? Alex doesn't seem to mind." That was the last straw. I couldn't have her in my apartment any longer. "Pack your stuff. You need to leave. First thing tomorrow," I said firmly. Liza looked stunned, finally realizing I was serious. "You can't kick me out. Where will I go?" "That's not my problem. You should have thought of that before," I replied, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. It hurt, but it was necessary. The next morning, Liza left. She was out of my life again, and this time I hoped it was for good. As she walked out the door, her parting shot was, "You'll regret this, Ella. I promise you that." As the wedding day approached, the air was thick with excitement and a bit of last-minute chaos. Alex's mom, Janet, who used a wheelchair, had become more like family to me. We'd spent countless afternoons together, chatting and planning the wedding. "I always hoped Alex would find someone who cares as much as you do, Ella. You're a blessing to us," Janet would often say with a warm smile, making me feel all the more welcomed and loved in this new family. The day of the wedding rehearsal finally came, and our close friends and relatives gathered at the venue. Everyone was buzzing with happiness, everyone except for one, Liza. When she arrived, wearing a dress that was way too revealing for a family gathering, I felt my stomach churn. She sauntered around Alex, laughing too loudly at his jokes, touching his arm every chance she got. My heart pounded with annoyance, and I could feel Alex's discomfort. "I need a minute," I muttered to Alex and pulled him aside, out of earshot from the others. "I can't stand watching her hang all over you. It's disrespectful, and it's supposed to be our special day." Alex took my hands in his expression softening. "Hey, look at me. Nothing she does changes how I feel about you. Okay? She's background noise, that's all." I nodded, trying to calm down, when Liza's laughter echoed across the room, slicing through the chatter like a knife. I snapped. Striding over to where Liza was standing, I fixed her with a glare that I hoped would melt steel. "Liza, you need to leave. Now," I said, my voice louder than intended, drawing a few curious glances from the guests. Liza's eyes widened, but she didn't make a scene. Instead, she scoffed, flipped her hair over her shoulder, and walked out without another word. Relief washed over me as I watched her leave. Turning back to the gathering, I caught my mom's eye. She approached, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What was that all about?" Mom asked, her voice low. "I don't want her here, Mom. Not today, not at the wedding. She's done enough damage," I said, my voice firm. Mom nodded, her eyes softening. "I understand, honey. And well, there's something you should know about George. He and I are divorced. He turned out to be much worse than we thought, especially after the drinking got bad. He's not just out of my life, he's out of ours completely." My mind reeled. "And Liza? She's on her own now. George had a stroke and can barely manage, she's looking after him. They're not our concern anymore, Ella," Mom added, almost as if she were convincing herself too. The drama was behind us, and all that was left was to look forward to the beginning of a new chapter with Alex, free from the shadows of the past. The first year of marriage had flown by, seemingly perfect, with me setting up a small space in our apartment to continue my nail business. It was an ideal setup. I could work while still being there for Janet, my mother-in-law, who needed daily care due to her disability. Things seemed to be going well, until I started noticing a change in Alex. He began working late more often and his business trips became more frequent. At first, I thought it was just the strain of new responsibilities at work, but then I began to feel the distance between us growing. And my worries only deepened the day I overheard Janet talking on the phone while I was setting up my tools for a client. "Yes, my dear, I'm so excited. A grandson will be such a joy," she chuckled into the receiver. I paused, my heart skipping a beat. I was definitely not pregnant. Something didn't add up. After her call, I approached her, trying to sound casual. "Janet, who's having a grandson? Did I hear you right?" She looked up, startled, then flushed a deep red. "Oh, just messing with my old friend, dear. You know, making her jealous." It sounded off. Way off. My gut twisted with suspicion, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. One of my regular clients, Maria, who used to work as a PI, still had all her contacts. "Maria, I need to find out what's going on. Can you help me?" I asked during her appointment. "Of course, Ella. Give me a few days. I'll dig around and see what I can find," she assured me, her tone serious and professional. It didn't take long for Maria to get back to me with news that felt like a punch to the gut. Alex was having an affair. And not just with anyone, with Liza. She was pregnant. I felt a cold calm settle over me as I processed the betrayal. I didn't confront Alex. Instead, I waited, gathering my strength for what came next. The opportunity presented itself when Alex walked through the door with a set of divorce papers in his hand. "Ella, I'm sorry, but this just isn't working. I've met someone else," he said bluntly, his eyes not meeting mine. "Oh? And who might that be, Alex?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the storm raging inside me. "It's Liza. She's expecting my child." She's exciting, Ella. You've just become too predictable, too dull, he admitted coldly. Pack your stuff. I signed the papers then and there, handing them back to him with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Before I go, Alex, just one last thing. He looked at me, confused. What? Liza will be bringing her father with her. Did she tell you that? He had a stroke and can't take care of himself. And he's got debts, massive ones, from the divorce settlement with my mother. Good luck handling that, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth but necessary. Alex's face paled. What? No, she didn't mention any. And there's more. I filed a lawsuit for adultery. With proof. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, I continued, cutting him off. As I walked out, the cool air hit my face, and I felt a sense of freedom. The pain of betrayal still stung, but I knew I was moving towards something better. Something that was truly meant for me. After the dust settled from the divorce, the settlement from Alex and Liza was substantial enough that I could finally open my own nail salon, a dream I had shelved in the quieter corners of my mind for too long. The grand opening of Ella's Elegance was a hit. The local newspaper even covered the event, and the community support was overwhelming. I hired a few skilled technicians, and we quickly became a favorite in town for our meticulous work and calming atmosphere. One quiet afternoon, while I was sorting through some inventory in the back, my mom called. I always looked forward to our talks. They were the little moments of peace in my often hectic days. Hi, Mom, what's up? I asked, smiling as I paused to sit down. Oh, nothing much. I just heard from an old friend of mine. Liza had her baby, she said hesitantly, probably expecting me to react negatively. Instead, I found myself smiling, genuinely hoping that child brought her more joy than she had brought to others. That's good to hear, Mom. I hope they're both healthy. Speaking of which, I've got a little surprise for Alex that I think will close this chapter of my life for good. A couple of days later, I received a call from Alex that I had been half expecting, half dreading. He sounded desperate and defeated, a far cry from the confident man who had handed me divorce papers. Ella, I received the documents from you. He started, his voice shaky. I can't believe it. Liza's child. I'm not the father? His voice cracked with the question. You're not surprised? You shouldn't be. You know what kind of person she is, I replied, my words deliberate and cold. There was a heavy silence before he continued. Ella, she's gone. I kicked her and her father out. It's been hell. Can we forget all this? Start over? I need you, Ella, he pleaded. The words might have tugged at my heartstrings once, but that time was long gone. Alex, you don't need me. You need a caretaker and a way to pay your debts. I'm not falling for that again. Take care of yourself, I said firmly before hanging up the phone. Sitting back in my chair, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The last tie to a painful past had been cut, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe freely. I'm Lydia, and this is the story of how my life turned upside down. But let's start from the beginning. I grew up in a wealthy family, the only child of doting parents who gave me everything I could ever want. My father, Robert, was a successful businessman, and my mother, Eleanor, was a socialite who threw the best parties in town. They showered me with love and attention, making sure I never lacked anything. When I entered college, I was determined to make my parents proud. I buried myself in books, focusing solely on my studies. That's when Tom entered my life. Tom was persistent, I'll give him that. He'd wait for me after classes, bring me coffee during late-night study sessions, and even showed up at my parents' house one day. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, he said, standing tall in our living room. I'm in love with your daughter, and I want you to know my intentions are serious. My father was impressed. He'd always wanted a son, someone to take under his wing and groom for the business world. Tom seemed to fit the bill perfectly. "Lydia," my father said to me later that evening, "why don't you give this young man a chance? He seems like a good catch." Reluctantly, I agreed to go on a date with Tom. To my surprise, I found myself enjoying his company. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and dreams. Our relationship blossomed quickly. Before I knew it, we were walking down the aisle, fresh out of college. My parents were overjoyed, especially my father, who saw Tom as the son he never had. "Welcome to the family, son," my father said, clapping Tom on the back at our wedding reception. "I have big plans for us." True to his word, my father helped Tom start his own business, a state-of-the-art car wash. He bought all the necessary equipment and even helped us purchase a small, cozy house. A year into our marriage, I gave birth to our son, Michael. Holding him in my arms for the first time, I felt a love I had never experienced before. I threw myself into motherhood, becoming a full-time housewife. My days were filled with diaper changes, feeding schedules, and lullabies. As the years rolled by, our lives settled into a routine. Michael grew from a gurgling baby into a curious toddler, then a mischievous child, and finally a brooding teenager. I poured my heart and soul into raising him, while Tom continued to struggle with the car wash business. "Your father thinks I'm a failure," Tom spat one evening after another tense phone call. "He's always looking down on me, giving me handouts like I'm some charity case." I tried to reassure him. "That's not true, Tom. Dad's just trying to help." These arguments became more frequent, and I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home. Michael, now in his late teens, began to withdraw, spending more time in his room or out with friends. As for me, well, the years of stress and housework had taken their toll. I was no longer the slim college girl Tom had wooed. My once toned body had softened, and I'd gained weight. Tom didn't hesitate to point this out. "You've really let yourself go, Lydia," he'd say, eyeing me with disappointment. "What happened to that pretty girl I married?" His words stung, but I tried to brush them off. I told myself he was just stressed about work, that he didn't really mean it. But deep down, I knew our marriage was crumbling. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a sunny Tuesday when I received the call that would shatter my world. "Mrs. Thompson," a somber voice said. "I'm afraid there's been an accident. Your parents, they were in a small plane crash in Hawaii." "I'm so sorry, but they didn't survive." The next few weeks passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and paperwork. Tom was surprisingly absent during this time, leaving me to handle everything on my own. When he was around, he seemed almost cheerful. "We need to sort out the inheritance," he said, barely a week after the funeral. "Have you spoken to the lawyer yet?" I was shocked by his insensitivity. "Tom, I'm still grieving. Can't this wait?" He shrugged. "Business doesn't wait, Lydia. We need to know where we stand financially." Reluctantly, I agreed to meet with the family lawyer, Mr. Jacobson. As we sat in his plush office, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Thompson, your parents' will is unusual. It's divided into 2 parts. I can only reveal the first part now. The second part will be disclosed in exactly 1 year." Tom leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "Well, what does the first part say?" Mr. Jacobson adjusted his glasses. "Your parents have left their mansion to your future grandchildren, with their guardians as trustees until they come of age." I was stunned. "But Michael is our only child, and he's not even married yet." As if on cue, Michael, who had insisted on coming to the meeting, let out a low whistle. "Wow, that opens up some interesting possibilities, doesn't it?" I turned to look at my son, confused by his reaction, but he avoided my gaze. Tom, on the other hand, was fuming. "That's it?" he demanded. "What about the rest of their assets? The businesses? The money?" Mr. Jacobson shook his head. I'm afraid that information is in the second part of the will, which cannot be revealed for another year. As we left the lawyer's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Tom was uncharacteristically quiet, while Michael seemed lost in thought. Just a few weeks after the reading of the will, Michael dropped a bombshell that left me reeling. "Mom, Dad," he announced one evening at dinner, "I have someone I want you to meet." The next day, he brought home a young woman named Sarah. She was pretty, with long blonde hair and a saccharine smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This is my wife," Michael said, his arm around her waist. "And she's pregnant with our child." I nearly choked on my tea. Wife? Pregnant? But, when did all this happen? Michael shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "We've been dating for a while. When we found out about the baby, we decided to get married right away." I couldn't help but notice how his eyes flickered to Tom, who was nodding approvingly. Something about this whole situation felt off, but I pushed my doubts aside. After all, I was going to be a grandmother. "Well, congratulations," I said, trying to muster up some enthusiasm. "This is quite a surprise." Sarah's smile widened. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'm so excited to be part of your family." From that day on, our household dynamics shifted dramatically. Sarah moved in, citing the need to be close to family during her pregnancy. At first, I was thrilled to have a female companion in the house. However, it quickly became apparent that Sarah had her own agenda. She began to subtly undermine me at every turn. When I'd cook dinner, she'd wrinkle her nose and say, "Oh, is that how you make it?" I always thought it was done differently. But it was her interactions with Tom that really set off alarm bells. She'd laugh at his jokes, touch his arm, and shower him with compliments. "You're such a talented businessman, Tom," she'd coo. "I don't know how you manage it all." Tom, predictably, lapped up the attention. He began spending more time at home, but not with me. He'd sit for hours, talking business with Sarah while I was relegated to the background. I tried to talk to Michael about Sarah's behavior, but he brushed off my concerns. "Mom, you're just being paranoid," he'd say. "Sarah's great. Maybe you're just jealous because you're not the center of attention anymore." His words hurt more than he could know. Had I raised a son who cared so little for his mother's feelings? As for Tom, he seemed to revel in the new family dynamic. He'd beam with pride when Sarah complimented him, and I'd catch him looking at me with something akin to disgust. One day, while out grocery shopping, I ran into an old college friend, Jessica. We decided to catch up over coffee, and as we reminisced about our college days, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Remember that guy who was always chasing rich girls?" Jessica asked. "What was his name? Tom something?" My heart skipped a beat. "Tom? Tom who?" Jessica laughed. "Oh, you know, that sleazy guy who tried to date every girl with wealthy parents. He ended up marrying some naive rich girl, if I remember correctly." As Jessica continued talking, describing Tom's behavior in college, I felt like I was going to be sick. The Tom she was describing sounded exactly like my husband. Had our entire marriage been based on a lie? With a heavy heart and shaking hands, I pulled into our driveway. The house loomed before me, no longer the cozy home I once loved, but a stage for the drama that was about to unfold. I found Tom in his study, poring over some papers. He barely looked up when I entered. "Tom," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "we need to talk." He sighed, finally meeting my eyes. "What is it now, Lydia?" I took a deep breath. "I ran into Jessica today. You remember her from college, right?" A flicker of something, was it fear? Passed across his face before he schooled his features into indifference. Vaguely. "What about her?" "She told me about a guy in college. A guy who pursued rich girls, looking for an easy meal ticket." I paused, watching his reaction. "Sound familiar, Tom?" For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, to my shock, he started laughing. Well, he chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Took you long enough to figure it out, didn't it? His cavalier attitude stunned me. So it's true? You married me for my parents' money? Tom shrugged, not a hint of remorse in his eyes. Of course I did. Look, Lydia. I never loved you. I tolerated you because you were my meal ticket. But now? Now you're just a fat, useless burden. His words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, tears welling in my eyes. Why are you telling me this now? I whispered. A cruel smile twisted his lips. Because, my dear wife, I don't need you anymore. Your parents are dead, and soon, their fortune will be mine. Or rather, our grandson's, which amounts to the same thing. Suddenly, everything clicked into place: Michael's hasty marriage, Sarah's convenient pregnancy, the way they'd been treating me. It had all been a calculated move to secure my parents' inheritance. You planned all this? I gasped. Tom laughed again, the sound grating on my nerves. Give credit where it's due. It was mostly Michael's idea. The boy's got a good head for business, unlike his mother. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of their betrayal crushing me. Does Sarah know about this? Of course she does, Tom sneered. She's a smart girl, knows a good opportunity when she sees one. Unlike you, she'll make a proper wife for a businessman. I couldn't take any more. I turned and fled from the room, my world shattered around me. As the reality of my situation sank in, I realized I had nowhere to go. I had no money of my own, not even enough to rent an apartment. With a heavy heart, I resigned myself to staying in the house with people I could no longer trust. 2 months later, Tom dropped another bombshell on me. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when he strode in with a self-satisfied smirk on his face. Pack your bags, Lydia, he announced without preamble. We're moving into your parents' house. I nearly dropped the knife I was holding. What? When did we decide this? Tom's laugh was cold and mocking. We didn't decide anything. I decided. We're moving in with Michael and Sarah. After all, our grandson is the heir to that house. Each word was like a slap to my face. What do you mean? What about our house? Oh, that? Tom waved dismissively. I sold it. The money's already been spent on things for people I actually care about. And just so we're clear, you're not on that list. Over the next few days, I watched in stunned silence as Tom, Michael, and Sarah excitedly prepared for the move. They bought new cars, splurged on expensive clothes and gadgets, all while I faded into the background, ignored and forgotten. The move to my parents' house was like a twisted parody of a happy family relocation. Sarah immediately claimed the master bedroom, while I was relegated to a small guest room in the back of the house. As the days passed, I found myself increasingly isolated. Sarah gave birth to my grandson and began delegating all the housework to me. I cooked, cleaned, and even cared for my grandson while she lounged about, issuing orders like a queen. Lydia, she'd call out. The baby needs changing. And while you're at it, could you tidy up the living room? It's looking a bit messy. I threw myself into caring for my grandson, finding solace in his innocent smiles and gurgles. But even that joy was tainted by the constant barbs and criticism from Sarah and Tom. One evening, about a month after we'd moved in, things came to a head. We were all seated at the dinner table, a dinner I had prepared, as usual. Sarah was in rare form, ordering me about as if I were a servant. Lydia, fetch me some more water. And hurry up with clearing these plates. We don't have all night. Something in me snapped. Years of pent-up frustration and hurt came pouring out. Enough, I shouted, slamming my hands on the table. I am not your maid, Sarah. This is my parents' house, and I deserve some respect. The room fell silent. Sarah's face crumpled, and she burst into dramatic tears. How could you speak to me like that? After all we've done for you? Tom stood up, his face red with anger. That's it, Lydia. I've had enough of your ingratitude. Pack your things and get out. This house belongs to our grandson now, and you're no longer welcome here. I stared at him in disbelief. You can't be serious. Where am I supposed to go? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of papers. I've been waiting for the right moment to give you these. Divorce papers, already signed. I want you gone by morning. I looked to Michael, hoping against hope that my son would defend me. But he just shrugged, avoiding my gaze. I'm an adult now, Mom. I don't need you anymore. With shaking hands, I took the divorce papers. Sarah's triumphant smirk was the last thing I saw as I turned and walked out of the dining room, my world crumbling around me. With nowhere to go and my world in shambles, I found myself dialing a familiar number. Jessica, my old college friend, answered on the second ring. Lydia, is everything okay? Her voice was laced with concern. I swallowed hard. Not really. I need a place to stay. Without hesitation, Jessica invited me to her home. As I settled into her guest room, she shared her own family drama. My son's been going through hell, she confided. His fiancée left him, and she's pregnant. He's desperate to find her and be there for his child. My heart skipped a beat. Do you have a picture of her? Jessica nodded, pulling out her phone. As she showed me the photo, my blood ran cold. Staring back at me was Sarah, my supposed daughter-in-law. Jessica, I said slowly, I think I know where your son's fiancée is. Over cups of tea, I poured out my story. Jessica listened, her expression morphing from shock to anger to determination. We need to expose them, she declared. All of them. Together, we hatched a plan. The next day, I returned to my parents' house under the guise of collecting the last of my belongings. While there, I managed to snag a few strands of my grandson's hair for a DNA test. The wait for the results was agonizing, but when they finally came, they confirmed our suspicions. My son was not the father of Sarah's baby. Jessica's son was. As I grappled with how to break this news to Michael and Tom, my phone rang. It was Mr. Jacobson, my parents' lawyer. Mrs. Thompson, he said, it's time to review the second part of your parents' will. Can you come to my office tomorrow? The next day, I sat in Mr. Jacobson's plush office, my heart pounding. As he read the will, I could hardly believe my ears. To our beloved daughter, Lydia, he read, we leave our luxury apartment, valued at $500,000. But that wasn't all. My parents had foreseen everything. In the event of a divorce, all their property, including Tom's business, would come to me. Your father wants you to know, Mr. Jacobson continued, that he's been the one financing Tom's business all along. He registered it in his own name. In case of divorce, it's yours to do with as you please. I sat there, stunned. All this time, I thought I had nothing, when in reality, I had everything. What about the house Tom and I lived in? I asked, remembering he had sold it. Mr. Jacobson smiled. That's the only thing Tom can claim. Everything else is yours. As the reality of my new situation sank in, I couldn't help but laugh. Tom had thought he was so clever, but in the end, he had outsmarted himself. I stepped into my new apartment and gasped. The space was breathtaking, all sleek lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, and tasteful, expensive furnishings. For the first time in years, I felt truly at home. As I was exploring my new sanctuary, my phone rang. It was Michael. Mom, he said without preamble, it's been a year since the first part of the will was read. We need to know what's in the second part. His tone was demanding, entitled. I'm sure Grandpa and Grandma left everything to me, right? I couldn't help but chuckle inwardly at his presumption. Michael, this isn't a conversation we should have over the phone. Why don't you, Sarah, and your father come over tomorrow morning? I'll text you the address. After hanging up, I called Jessica. It's time, I told her. Can you come over tomorrow morning? We're going to settle this once and for all. The next day, I heard the doorbell ring. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to find Tom, Michael, Sarah, and the baby standing there. Their jaws dropped as they took in the luxurious surroundings. Michael whistled. "Wow, Mom. This place is amazing. I can't wait to move in." Sarah's eyes gleamed with greed. "Yes, it'll be so nice once we get rid of all this old lady decor. And of course, once we get rid of you, Lydia." I raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't be so hasty if I were you. Please, come in and have a seat." As they settled onto the plush sofa, I excused myself for a moment. When I returned, I wasn't alone. Jessica stood beside me, her presence causing Sarah to pale visibly. "Before we discuss the will," I said, my voice steady, "there's someone I'd like you all to meet. This is my friend, Jessica." Sarah's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. Michael and Tom just looked confused. "Now," I continued, "I think it's time we all had a frank discussion. There are some truths that need to be revealed." I paused, savoring the moment. All night, I had rehearsed what I was about to say. The words I had practiced, the revelations I was about to make, would change everything. As I looked at the faces of those who had betrayed me, my ex-husband, my son, and the woman who had tried to steal my life, I felt a surge of righteous anger mixed with anticipation. As Jessica got closer, Tom's eyes widened with recognition. A smirk spread across his face as he let out a bitter laugh. Well, he sneered, gesturing towards me. "Looks like I achieved my goal after all. Married a rich fool, didn't I?" His words stung, but I held my ground. "We'll address your betrayal later, Tom. Right now, there's something more pressing to discuss." I turned to Sarah, who was visibly squirming. "We know the truth about you, Sarah." Michael looked confused. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I took a deep breath. Sarah was looking for a rich husband. When she heard about the will from you, Michael, she saw an opportunity. She decided to pass off someone else's child as your own, to get her hands on your grandparents' estate. Jessica stepped forward, her voice steady. "The baby isn't Michael's. It's my son's child." The room fell silent. Then, I produced the DNA test results. Sarah's face drained of color as realization dawned. In a flurry of movement, Sarah grabbed her bag. "I don't need this. I don't need a beggar's child," she shouted as she fled the apartment. Michael stood there, shell-shocked, the baby still in his arms. He looked lost, pathetic even. Tom, recovering from the initial shock, asked in a small voice, "So, who gets this apartment?" I couldn't help but smile. "Well, Tom, let me enlighten you about the second part of my parents' will." I explained everything, the apartment, the car wash, all of it. Tom's face fell with each revelation. Suddenly, Tom was on his knees. "Lydia, please, I'm sorry. Forgive me. We can work this out." I looked at him coldly. "Get out, Tom. You have 2 days to leave my parents' house, or I'm calling the police." As Tom scrambled to his feet, he turned to Michael. "Son, give me the car I bought you. I need something." Michael's response was curt. "No. It's mine. You're not getting anything from me." With one last desperate look, Tom slunk out of the apartment. I then turned to Michael, who stood there, head bowed in shame. Jessica gently took the baby from his arms. "Michael," I said, my voice firm but not unkind, "since it turns out I don't have any grandchildren, there are no other heirs to your grandparents' home besides me. I need you to move out as well." He nodded, not meeting my eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. For everything. I'll go pack my things." With that, he too left the apartment. As the door closed behind him, I let out a long breath. The apartment was quiet now, save for the soft coos of the baby in Jessica's arms. I looked at my old friend, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a strange sense of liberation. "Well," I said, managing a small smile, That didn't go quite how I expected when I woke up this morning. Jessica nodded, bouncing the baby gently. You did what you had to do, Lydia. They left you no choice. As I sank onto the plush sofa, I realized that for the first time in years, I was truly free. Free from deception, free from manipulation, and free to live life on my own terms. The months following the confrontation flew by in a whirlwind of change and self-discovery. I found myself settling into my luxurious apartment, the space becoming a sanctuary of peace and new beginnings. One of my first decisions was to rent out my parents' house. It felt right, somehow, to have the property occupied by a young family who appreciated its warmth and history. The rental income provided a comfortable cushion, adding to the proceeds from selling Tom's car wash business. My friendship with Jessica blossomed. We'd meet for coffee, sharing stories, and supporting each other through the ups and downs of our new realities. And then there was little Tommy, Jessica's grandson, the child I had once believed to be my own. Despite the painful circumstances of his birth, I found myself developing a deep affection for the boy. He has your eyes, Jessica would joke during our visits, and we'd laugh, finding humor in the absurdity of our intertwined lives. My relationship with Michael was a work in progress. The betrayal had cut deep, but he was still my son, and I couldn't bring myself to sever that bond completely. Our interactions were tentative at first, awkward phone calls, and stilted meetings in neutral coffee shops. But slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild. As for Tom, he became a ghost in my past. I heard through the grapevine that he'd fallen on hard times, his grandiose dreams of wealth and status crumbling in the wake of his exposed deceit. I saw him only once, by chance, as I was driving through town. He was working at a small kiosk, looking older and wearier than I remembered. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt a flicker of something, not love or longing, but a kind of closure. Then the light changed, and I drove on, leaving that chapter of my life firmly in the rearview mirror. My name is Carly, and I never thought my life would turn into such a roller coaster. It all started when I was working as a perfume sales manager at a high-end department store. One day, a tall, handsome guy walked into the store. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his phone as he approached the counter. "Hi," he said, his voice a bit shaky. "I need help choosing a perfume for my mom." I couldn't help but find his concern for his mother endearing. "Don't worry," I reassured him. "We'll find something perfect. Let's start with some popular choices." As we sampled different fragrances, I learned his name was Michael. He was 28, worked for his family's construction company, and lived nearby. We chatted easily, and I found myself drawn to his warm brown eyes and shy smile. After nearly an hour, we finally settled on an elegant floral scent. As I wrapped up the bottle, Michael hesitated. Carly? Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" My heart skipped a beat. "I'd love to," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. That coffee date turned into dinner, which led to more dates. Michael was sweet, attentive, and made me laugh. We shared similar interests in movies, hiking, and trying new restaurants. Before I knew it, we were officially a couple. Everything was perfect until the day I met his mother, Evelyn. Michael had warned me she could be a bit intense, but nothing prepared me for the reality. We arrived at a fancy restaurant for a family dinner. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, her sharp eyes scrutinizing me as we approached. She was impeccably dressed, her graying hair styled in a severe bun. "So, this is the girl you've been seeing," she said, her tone cold. She barely acknowledged my extended hand, giving it a limp shake. Michael's father, Robert, seemed nice enough, offering a warm smile. His older brother, Thomas, gave a curt nod. As we sat down, Evelyn launched into an interrogation. "Where did you say you work, Carly?" "I'm a perfume sales manager at." She cut me off. "Retail, how quaint. And your family? What do your parents do?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "My dad's a high school teacher, and my mom." "A teacher?" Evelyn's eyebrows shot up. Well, I suppose someone has to do it. The dinner continued in this vein, with Evelyn making thinly veiled insults and dismissive comments. Michael squeezed my hand under the table, but said nothing to defend me. As we left the restaurant, Evelyn pulled me aside. "Listen carefully, Carly," she hissed. "I run this family. I decide what's best for my sons. If you want a future with Michael, you'll need to prove your worth." I was too shocked to respond. When Michael proposed, I was over the moon. But my joy was short-lived. Evelyn immediately took over the wedding planning, dictating everything from the venue to the guest list. I tried to stand up for myself. "Actually, I had some ideas." "Ideas are nice, dear," Evelyn cut in, "but let's leave this to the professionals, shall we?" Michael gave me a pleading look. "Just go along with it," he whispered. "It's easier this way." And so, I watched as my dream wedding transformed into Evelyn's spectacle. I told myself it was just one day, that things would be different once we were married and living on our own. The first few months of marriage were a whirlwind. Michael and I moved into a small apartment, and I reveled in the joy of setting up our own space. But even as we unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, Evelyn's presence loomed large. She'd drop by unannounced, often when Michael was at work. "Just checking in," she'd say, her eyes scanning our home critically. "Oh dear, is this how you've arranged the living room? Let me show you a better way." I'd grit my teeth and smile, reminding myself that she was just trying to help. But her help felt more like an invasion. One evening, as Michael and I were having dinner, my phone rang. It was my boss, offering me a promotion to senior sales manager. I was thrilled. It was the opportunity I'd been working towards for years. The next evening, we sat around Evelyn's dining table. The tension was palpable as she served a roast that looked perfect, but tasted like cardboard in my mouth. "Carly," Evelyn began, her tone sickly sweet. "Michael tells me you've been offered a promotion." "How nice." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, I'm very excited about it." Evelyn's smile tightened. "Well, dear, I think it's time we discussed your future. Your real future. We need someone in sales, and with your experience, you'd be perfect." I took a deep breath. "Evelyn, I appreciate the offer, but I'm happy in my current job. I don't want to leave it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "I see. So, you don't consider yourself part of this family then?" I felt my temper rising. "With all due respect, Evelyn, you don't get to decide what's best for my marriage or my career." Evelyn stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I think you need to reconsider your priorities, young lady. Michael, talk some sense into your wife." As she stormed out of the room, I turned to Michael, expecting support. Instead, he looked torn. "Carly, maybe we should think about this. Mom knows what she's doing." The drive home was silent, filled with unspoken words and growing resentment. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that my battle wasn't just with Evelyn. It was with the entire dynamic of this family I had married into. The tension in our home grew thicker with each passing day. One Sunday afternoon, we were all gathered at Evelyn's for a barbecue. I was in the kitchen, helping to prepare salads, when Evelyn's voice carried from the patio. "It's such a shame," she was saying loudly. "I remember Thomas's ex-wife. She was just as ungrateful as Carly." But I showed her the door. I kicked her out of this family myself. I felt my cheeks burn. Thomas, Michael's older brother, shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, please," he muttered. But Evelyn was on a roll. "I'm just saying, a woman should know her place. Isn't that right, Robert?" Robert, Michael's father, just grunted noncommittally. I'd noticed he rarely spoke up against his wife. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched out to the patio, salad bowl in hand. "Evelyn," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "if you have something to say to me, why don't you say it to my face?" The backyard fell silent. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Fine. You want to know what I think? I think you're not good enough for this family. You're stubborn, you're disrespectful, and you're pulling Michael away from his responsibilities. I felt like I'd been slapped. Responsibilities? You mean being your puppet? Carly, Michael pleaded. Please, let's not do this here. I whirled on him. And you? When are you going to stand up to her? When are you going to be a husband instead of a mama's boy? The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I'd crossed a line. Michael's face crumpled, and Evelyn looked triumphant. You see, she crowed. This is who you really are. A spiteful, ungrateful girl who doesn't appreciate what she has. I felt tears pricking at my eyes. Without another word, I turned and ran into the house, grabbing my purse and keys. The weeks following the barbecue incident were tense. Michael and I barely spoke, tiptoeing around each other in our own home. I threw myself into my work, staying late at the office to avoid the suffocating silence at home. One evening, I returned from work to find Michael sitting at the kitchen table, a serious expression on his face. We need to talk, he said. Mom called today. She wants us to come over for her birthday dinner next week. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Michael, I don't think that's a good idea. Please, he pleaded. It would mean a lot to me. And maybe it's a chance to start over? I wanted to refuse, to tell him I was done playing nice with a woman who clearly despised me. But the hope in his eyes made me hesitate. Fine, I said finally. But this is the last chance, Michael. I mean it. The night of Evelyn's birthday arrived, and I found myself standing in front of her door, a forced smile plastered on my face. As we entered, Evelyn greeted us with her usual fake warmth. Carly, dear, she cooed, air-kissing my cheek. So glad you could make it. I was worried you might be too busy with your little job. I bit my tongue, reminding myself to stay calm. The evening progressed with forced pleasantries and thinly veiled insults. I noticed how Evelyn dominated every conversation, her sons and husband merely nodding along. As the night wore on, Evelyn announced it was time for cake. Carly, be a dear and bring out the cake. And don't forget the candles. I headed to the kitchen, grateful for a moment's respite. I carefully placed the candles on the cake, counting under my breath to make sure I had the right number. Back in the dining room, I set the cake down in front of Evelyn. Her eyes narrowed as she counted the candles. Carly, she said, her voice dangerously sweet. There's one extra candle here. Can't you even do a simple task correctly? Or perhaps you're trying to insinuate something about my age? No, of course not, Enough, Evelyn snapped. She began plucking out the candles one by one. Since you've clearly ruined the design, you might as well see the mess you've made. Come closer, dear. Take a good look. Hesitantly, I leaned in. Suddenly, I felt a hand on the back of my head, pushing me down. Before I could react, my face was shoved into the cake. I gasped, struggling to breathe as frosting filled my nose and mouth. After what felt like an eternity, Evelyn released me. I straightened up, sputtering and wiping cake from my eyes. The room was silent, save for Evelyn's cruel laughter. Oh dear, she chuckled. Looks like someone's made a mess of themselves. I looked around the room in disbelief. The other guests were averting their eyes, some letting out nervous giggles. And Michael? Michael was staring at the floor, his face red with embarrassment. Without a word, I turned and fled to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. As I scrubbed the cake from my face, I could hear muffled voices outside. A soft knock came at the door. Carly? It was Michael. Are you okay? Do you need help? I yanked the door open, fixing him with a glare. Help? Now you want to help? He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. Mom can be a bit eccentric sometimes. We just need to. Eccentric? I hissed. Michael, she assaulted me. And you just stood there. Without another word, I pushed past him, grabbed my purse, and headed for the door. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The days following Evelyn's birthday disaster were a blur of tears, arguments, and sleepless nights. Michael tried to apologize, but his words rang hollow. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects. But even at work, I couldn't escape Evelyn's influence. One afternoon, as I was assisting a customer, I heard a familiar voice that made my blood run cold. "Excuse me, I'd like to speak to a manager." I turned to see Evelyn standing there, a malicious glint in her eye. My colleague, unaware of who she was, directed her to me. "I'm the senior sales manager. How can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Evelyn's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I have a complaint about the perfume I purchased here last week. The problem is that this perfume smells like cheap chemicals. And when I tried to return it, your staff was incredibly rude to me." I knew she was lying. We had a strict quality control process, and our return policy was more than fair. But before I could respond, she continued her tirade. "This is unacceptable. I demand to speak to your superior immediately." My manager, alerted by the commotion, hurried over. "What seems to be the problem here?" Evelyn launched into her fabricated story, painting me as an incompetent manager who had personally sold her a defective product and then refused to help. I tried to interject, to explain the situation, but my manager held up a hand to silence me. "I'm very sorry for your experience, ma'am. Please, come with me to my office. We'll sort this out immediately." As they walked away, Evelyn shot me a triumphant look over her shoulder. I stood there, humiliated and angry, as my colleagues whispered around me. An hour later, my manager called me into his office. His expression was grim. "Carly, I've received multiple complaints about your performance recently. And after today's incident, I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "What? But those complaints, they're not real." "It's my mother-in-law, she's trying to." He held up a hand. "Carly, please. I understand you're going through some personal issues, but we can't have them affecting your work like this. I'm sorry, but my decision is final." I left the office in a daze, my personal belongings in a small box. I drove home, tears blurring my vision. When I arrived, Michael was waiting, his face etched with concern. "Carly, what happened?" Mom said. "Your mother," I spat, "just cost me my job." I recounted the events of the day, my voice rising with each word. "And you want to know the worst part? She used our phone number to file those fake complaints." "Our phone number, Michael? The one you gave her without even asking me?" I locked myself in our bedroom, ignoring his pleas from the other side of the door. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was at a crossroads. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly under attack from Evelyn and unsupported by my own husband. The weeks following my job loss were some of the darkest I'd ever experienced. One evening, as I sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by job listings and unanswered applications, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I hear you're looking for work. Maybe it's time to reconsider my offer. Evelyn." I stared at the screen in disbelief. How had she gotten my new number? I'd changed it specifically to avoid her. As if on cue, Michael walked in. I held up my phone. "Did you give your mother my new number?" His hesitation was all the answer I needed. "Look, maybe we should consider her offer. It's for us. For our future." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "Our future?" "Michael, there won't be a future if this keeps up. If something doesn't change, and soon, I don't know if I can stay in this marriage." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite process what I'd said. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll talk to her. I promise. Just give me some time." I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard similar promises before. Still, what choice did I have? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't wait for Michael to stand up to his mother. I needed to find a job, to regain some semblance of independence. I reached out to an old colleague who had started her own online perfume business. She was sympathetic to my situation and offered me a position as an online consultant. The pay wasn't great, but it was something, a lifeline in the storm. But Evelyn wasn't done with me yet. As Christmas approached, the annual family gathering loomed on the horizon. I dreaded it, knowing it would be another opportunity for Evelyn to belittle and humiliate me. The night before the gathering, Michael and I had another argument. He wanted me to make more of an effort with his mother, to try to understand her perspective. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her perspective? I sputtered. Michael, her perspective is that I'm not good enough for this family, that I should quit my job and become her puppet. How am I supposed to understand that? He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. She's just set in her ways. If we could just... No, I cut him off. I'm done trying. If you won't stand up for me, for us, then I'll have to do it myself. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. Tomorrow, at the Christmas gathering, I would confront Evelyn once and for all. I was tired of being a victim, of letting her control my life. Christmas morning arrived, and with it, a sense of foreboding. We arrived to find Evelyn's house already bustling with activity. As we moved into the living room, I could feel Evelyn's eyes on me, assessing and judging. The rest of the family was already there, Robert, Thomas, and various aunts, uncles, and cousins. The afternoon progressed with forced pleasantries and thinly veiled insults. Evelyn, as usual, held court, dominating every conversation. I noticed how she kept bringing up the topic of children, her eyes darting to me each time. Finally, during dinner, she addressed me directly. "Carly, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I couldn't help but notice you're not drinking. Any special reason?" I felt my cheeks flush as all eyes turned to me. "No, Evelyn. I'm just not in the mood for alcohol." Her eyes narrowed. Well, I do hope you're not having difficulties in that area. It's just, well, you're not getting any younger. And with your career struggles, I thought perhaps you'd be focusing on more important matters by now." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "More important matters? You mean like being a submissive wife who gives up her dreams to please her mother-in-law?" Gasps echoed around the table. Evelyn's face contorted with rage. "How dare you speak to me like that in my own home?" "No, Evelyn," I shot back. "How dare you treat me like this? I am your son's wife, not your punching bag. I've had enough of your manipulation and your cruelty." I turned to leave, but as I passed Evelyn, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Evelyn made a sudden movement, knocking over her mug of hot tea. The scalding liquid splashed directly onto me. I screamed in pain as the hot tea soaked through my clothes. Evelyn, however, seemed unfazed by what she had done. She grabbed my arm, pulling me close. "Listen here, you little brat," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. "You will obey me. You will do as I say. Or I will destroy you." Through the haze of pain, I looked around the room, desperate for help. But everyone, including Michael, seemed frozen in shock. Finally Michael stood up, his face pale. I need some air," he mumbled, before fleeing the room. In that moment, something inside me broke. Without another word, I wrenched my arm free and ran out of the house, ignoring the chaos erupting behind me. I drove to the nearest hospital, my skin still burning from the tea. As the doctors treated my burns, which thankfully weren't severe, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. When I finally returned home, the apartment was empty. I packed a bag with essentials, wrote a brief note explaining that I needed time away, and left. I woke up in the dingy motel room, my skin still tender from the burns. As I was contemplating my next move, my phone rang. I hesitated, half expecting it to be Michael or worse, Evelyn. To my surprise, it was my father-in-law, Robert. "Carly?" His voice sounded strained. "Can we meet? It's important." Curiosity got the better of me. "Okay," I said, giving him the motel address. An hour later, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Robert standing there, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he seemed to have aged overnight. "Robert, what's going on?" I asked, gesturing for him to sit down. "Carly, I'm so sorry," he blurted out as soon as I let him in. "There's something you need to know about the company, about Evelyn." He paused, his hands shaking slightly. "The company, it used to belong to my parents. Evelyn, she tricked my father when he was sick. Made him sign everything over to her, made herself the executive director." I felt my jaw drop. "What? But how? Why didn't you say anything?" Robert's eyes filled with tears. "I was a coward. I'd been collecting evidence for years, but I was too afraid to do anything with it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "But I can't stay silent anymore. Not after what happened yesterday. I need your help, Carly." With trembling hands, I opened the folder and began to read. What I found inside made my blood run cold. Evelyn had been hiding income for years, evading taxes on a massive scale. She'd been hiring undocumented workers, paying them a fraction of what they deserved and forcing them to work in appalling conditions. These workers, afraid of deportation, never complained about their treatment. But it got worse. The documents showed that many of the company's products were defective, failing to meet basic quality standards. Evelyn had been knowingly selling these subpar goods at full price, putting profits over people's safety. Then I came across a police report that made my heart stop. Thomas's ex-wife, who had worked in production, had discovered these illegal practices. She had threatened to report Evelyn to the authorities. In response, Evelyn had pushed her down a flight of stairs. The poor woman had sustained serious injuries, but Evelyn had intimidated her into silence. Shortly after, she had pressured Thomas into divorcing his wife. I looked up at Robert, my hands shaking. This is horrible. How could she do all this?" Robert broke down, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Carly. I should have spoken up years ago. I was afraid. Of her, of losing everything. But I can't live with this guilt anymore." As I watched my father-in-law cry, a mix of emotions washed over me. Anger at Evelyn's cruelty and greed. Sympathy for Robert and all the workers who had suffered. And a growing determination to put an end to this injustice. We contacted a reputable lawyer, Amanda Chen, who specialized in corporate fraud cases. She listened to our story with growing concern and immediately agreed to take on the case. It was a Tuesday afternoon when all hell broke loose. My phone exploded with notifications, missed calls, text messages, and voicemails, all from Evelyn. I steeled myself and listened to one of the voicemails. "You ungrateful little witch." Evelyn's voice screeched through the speaker. "How dare you turn my husband against me? I'll ruin you for this, do you hear me? I'll destroy you." The barrage continued relentlessly. Evelyn called every few minutes, alternating between threats and attempts at manipulation. When I blocked her number, she started using other people's phones. But it didn't stop there. Evelyn launched a full-scale character assassination campaign against me. She contacted friends, family, and even my former co-workers, spinning a tale of how I had seduced Robert and turned him against her. The biggest blow came when Michael sided with his mother. He showed up at my new rented apartment, his face a mask of anger and betrayal. "How could you do this to us?" he demanded. "To my mother?" I tried to explain, to show him the evidence, but he refused to listen. "I don't know who you are anymore," he spat before storming out. As I sat there, reeling from Michael's rejection, I received an unexpected call. It was Thomas, Michael's older brother. "Carly? It's Thomas. I heard what's happening. I want you to know, I believe you. And I want to help." Thomas's support was a turning point. He provided additional evidence of Evelyn's misdeeds and agreed to testify in court. With his help, we were also able to locate his ex-wife, Maria. Maria's testimony was damning. She recounted in detail the incident where Evelyn had pushed her down the stairs, as well as the subsequent threats and intimidation. As the trial date approached, Amanda worked tirelessly. She tracked down several of the undocumented workers Evelyn had exploited. Despite their fear, many agreed to testify, their stories painting a horrifying picture of abuse and exploitation. The trial was grueling. Evelyn's lawyers fought dirty, trying to discredit our witnesses and paint Robert and me as conspirators. But Amanda was brilliant, methodically presenting our evidence and dismantling the defense's arguments. The turning point came when Amanda presented the evidence of how Evelyn had manipulated Robert's father into signing over the company. The judge listened intently as Amanda argued for the annulment of the will. After what felt like an eternity, the judge made her ruling. The will was annulled, and ownership of the company was returned to Robert. Furthermore, the judge ordered a full investigation into the company's practices and Evelyn's personal finances. As the gavel fell, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Robert broke down in tears beside me, while Evelyn's shrieks of outrage echoed through the courtroom. The aftermath of the trial brought sweeping changes to everyone involved. As soon as Robert took control of the company, Michael, true to his mother's influence, resigned from his position. He cut off all communication with his father, unable to forgive what he saw as a betrayal of his mother. Robert found unexpected support in Thomas. The father and eldest son, both having experienced Evelyn's manipulation firsthand, formed a strong partnership. Together, they began the arduous task of restructuring the company, determined to run it ethically and efficiently. The legal proceedings didn't end with the trial. Robert filed for divorce, a process that was surprisingly quick given Evelyn's fall from grace. In the settlement, he left her the house they had shared for decades. It was a generous gesture, considering everything that had happened. The court ordered a thorough audit of the company's finances, and the results were staggering. Years of creative accounting and tax evasion came to light. Evelyn was hit with a massive fine and ordered to pay $500,000 in back taxes. The house Robert had left her became her only asset, and she was forced to sell it to settle her debts with the tax authorities. Meanwhile, my own marriage had crumbled beyond repair. Michael's unwavering loyalty to his mother, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of her misdeeds, was something I couldn't comprehend or accept. We filed for divorce, and I felt a mixture of sadness and relief as I signed the papers. As I contemplated my next steps, Robert approached me with an unexpected offer. "Carly," he said, his voice warm with gratitude, "I know you've been through hell because of our family. But I want you to know that I consider you family still. We're rebuilding the sales department, and I'd like you to be a part of it. What do you say?" I was touched by his offer and, after some consideration, I accepted. Months passed, and slowly but surely, I found my footing. I learned to navigate the intricacies of the construction business, mastering the art of selling everything from lumber to specialized tools. My experience in luxury retail, surprisingly, proved valuable in dealing with high-end clients and custom projects. It was on a routine shopping trip that I had an unexpected encounter. As I turned down the cereal aisle, I froze. There, just a few feet away, stood Michael and Evelyn. They looked haggard, a far cry from the polished appearance they once maintained. Evelyn's voice, shrill and angry, carried clearly. "You weak-willed idiot," she berated Michael. "Can't you do anything right? I asked for the bran flakes, not this sugary garbage." Michael, his shoulders slumped, muttered an apology and reached for another box. I felt a pang of pity, seeing how their toxic relationship had endured and seemingly worsened. For a moment, I considered approaching them. But as I watched their dysfunctional interaction, I realized I had nothing to say. Instead, I quietly turned my cart around and left the store, leaving my shopping unfinished.